be back. I'm excited for today. I feel a lot better about this week than I did last one. Today, I don't think I have too much time today, but I wanted to talk really quick about something I was thinking about and learning with concurrent mode in React, which I don't know if you guys have heard about concurrent mode. If you haven't, just definitely go check out this talk here. It's on Kent's Chats with Kent podcast, Season 1, Episode 4. He talks with Dan Abramov about what's coming up with React. We've known about concurrent mode for a long time. It's always fun to hear Dan talk about it a little bit more. Today I was encountered with a question in this PR I made for Next.js. I was refactoring the head component in Next.js to use hooks, and something came up with a question as regards to using refs in concurrent mode. And if you're not familiar with refs in React, let me show you what I mean really quick. A ref is where, well, there's a hook to do it actually. You can say react.useRef, my ref. And what this does is it's basically just a variable slot that's attached to the instance of your component. If you can think about it, under the hood, use state and use effect and use all these things, they all have something to do with the instance of the component. And it's tracking, variables across the instance. Under the hood, state is attaching some state to the instance and some updater, right? And useRef is kind of like a shortcut to just say, I want to attach something to the instance of my component. And doing that can be very powerful for when you get into sticky situations where hooks may feel, like the ergonomics of hooks may feel limiting, where useRef, it just kind of feels like JavaScript a little bit, like you're just assigning a variable. So if we wanted to update the variable of myRef, we could say myRef.current equals math.random. And every single time that this component renders, it's going to update the current value of myRef. And then we could actually render myRef.current, if it will render at all. Let's see, maybe I need to save it. Current, console, nothing in there. Let's turn it into a string. This is just like a little async or concurrent mode code sandbox that I found. So we'll see if I can get it to work. If it doesn't work, it's fine. It's not like you need to actually see anything. So this would render basically a random number every time we render it. In fact, we don't even need to use concurrent mode. We can just use the classic mode if we want. Element. You know what? Let's just ditch this weird code sandbox and go straight to a new one. I'm not even sure who created that other code sandbox, so we're just gonna go to a new React one and call it good. All right. We're not actually going to use concurrent mode here. I can still illustrate to you what is going to happen with your refs in concurrent mode. So right here we're rendering a new random number every single time our app renders. So this is interesting because what if we started off with a 0 and we just incremented this every single time it rendered? And in fact, let's just make a little counter button here. We don't even need a count. We'll just do this. Set state. And we'll say return a button. When we click this button, we're going to set state to a new object, and that's just going to cause our app to re-render. And inside of that button, we want to show the myRef.current, which is kind of like a weird little custom counter value for how many times we've rendered. So let's see, myRefCurrent is 0, myRefCurrent plus plus. I'm not sure why it's not showing up. Oh, Nigel Lemich says, did we already go over why to use ref instead of use state? That's an excellent question. I think that's a question that deserves like a really long video, actually. But there are certain situations where you may want to change values on your instance or keep track of things on a component instance without triggering a re-render. There are also situations where you may need to use a ref to keep track of a value that you don't want to trigger any change detection. Callbacks, non-memoized callbacks is one example of this, and I think I have a video about that actually. We can see if I can go find it here after this video is done. All right, so we have set state here, and myRef is equal to 0 right now. Let's just console log that out. Ref.current to make sure that we're getting 0. Guess I don't understand why this isn't rendering anything at all. Any ideas? Hey, there's the button. All right. That was funky. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, so every single time this component renders, it's going to have this 1 right here, right? So every time we click it, and yeah, and this is a very contrived example. Clearly, we could just use set state right here and it'd be fine. But that's not what I'm trying to show you. I'm trying to show you that this myRef.current is kind of like an internal counter on how many times this component has rendered. And React, the set state up here is an actual state component. So one way that I can illustrate this to you better is we'll do like example component right here. We're going to move all of the ref stuff into the example. So we're just going to return how many times. We're just going to return myRefCurrent, which is going to be how many times it's rendered. And then right here, instead of using the ref right here and all this myCurrent stuff, we're just going to have the set state thing be up here. We're just going to call this re-render, trigger re-render. And then up here, we will just put our little example component. Whoops. Okay, so every time we trigger this re-render, it's re-rendering our entire app, including examples. So you can see how many times example is re-rendering, even though there's no state in there. I hope that makes this contrived example a little bit better. So let me explain what will happen in concurrent mode. This does take a little bit of understanding of how concurrent mode is going to work, but basically, in concurrent mode, React can be working on a bunch of different components at the same time of rendering, right? And sometimes components can take a really long time to render. And React, in concurrent mode, is going to be smart enough to detect and handle components that are taking a long time to render. And if they are taking a long time to render, it's going to kind of pause work on that component and go and make sure the rest of the app is being responsive and rendering correctly. And then it will come back to that component that is taking a long time to render, or that is a complex component that's rendering. And it will complete the work there. What this means is that components are going to be able to run their render function multiple times without actually committing anything to the reconciler, to the render tree. So what it means is that this example function right here, this render component for this example, it may run this result or this function a couple of times if need be before it actually displays the new value. And you can see how that would be problematic, because if we re-rendered our app one time, right? But something happened somewhere else in our application or inside of this example component that caused something to suspend or to go into concurrency management mode, right? Well, this ref right here would get incremented for however many times this component ran, this function ran right here. And that's bad because we would be relying on the previous render state of our component for a future one. And what it says in React, what a lot of people, thought leaders and really smart people who work on React have said is that it's safe to put this inside of a use effect. And what this does is it guarantees that React, that this ref is not being updated unless the component has actually reconciled and been committed to the DOM. And you'll see you still get the same effect here, right? But now we're using this in a safe way. Now instead of myRef.current incrementing every time the render function runs itself, we're only doing that when we know that the component is actually done being rendered. Now there's a few circumstances that I want to show you where this rule can kind of be bent or broken. And one of these all has to do with dependencies on the last value. So if we wanted myRef.current to get just some random math value, like some random number from math, I mean, in this circumstance, honestly, this wouldn't really matter in concurrent mode because let's simulate this a little bit. Let's say we have one render function, right? Or we run this render function one time and it gives us this number. We undergo some concurrency performance optimizations under the hood with React, and it reruns our render function, for example, a couple more times, right? So it gets that, or it gets a new value, let's see, right here. Okay, and then finally right here it commits. So let's say we started with some value like this, and it was on mount. So React commits to the DOM, and that value right there is what we see. And then it runs this render function a couple of times, right? And then it finally commits, and now this value is what we see. Now, math random is just a random number, and that's all we wanted, and that's totally fine. Because we're not relying on any data inside of these, partial commits, inside of these commits that just got thrown away inside of this component. Now, once we do this, our plus plus like we had before, we run into a problem. Because now we start with 0, right? React will, I'm going to uncomment this so you guys can see it better. React runs our render function a few times, right? And finally commits to the DOM. And now we're seeing 3 instead of what we would expect to see as 1. Because if we're relying on render, if we're relying on the render function as some type of timing mechanism to handle like previous values, things are going to get out of sync because render can now happen more than one time between a change and actually rendering to the DOM. So what it means is it's kind of reminds me of use state, React use state. When you say set state, you have the old value, and you can take the old value and you can return like the old +1. That way you're not setting some like stale value. Well, it's very similar with refs now in concurrent mode. Is you shouldn't be mutating refs based on their previous values in the render function, and that's pretty much what it comes down to. Don't mutate refs current values in render if they rely on the previous value, on the previous ref's value. And that's because the previous ref's value is unstable. You don't know which render it could have come from. You don't know how many times it's run before. It should all be immutable and free of side effects is really what it means. Is any manipulations to your myref.current should be free of side effects. There are very, very few exceptions to this rule, I would say, and one of those is exactly kind of like I showed you, where if what you're doing is assigning just some random number, or you're keeping track of something that is immutable and will never technically change between renders, yeah, sure, that's okay. Like if you were to do like, you know, myref.current equals date.now, like, I don't know, maybe even that might run into some weird circumstances, but for the most part, we're not relying on some, you know, it's not like myref.current. If we were doing like myref.current equals and then relying on the previous value, like myref.current minus the date now, like if we were doing that, like that can get out of hand really quickly. It's because we're relying on some old value. We don't necessarily know how many times this component has run the render function before it actually pushes it out to the DOM. So if you guys wanted to go and kind of dive in deeper to why like I ran into this problem, you could check out this pull request I have open, refactoring next head to React hooks. It was basically the same exact issue. You know, somebody said, hey, I'm not sure if mutating that ref is unsafe, right? Well, it turned out the way the code was written was safe, but it may not have been it may not have been obvious to users that it was safe. So this is how it was before, and this is the change we made. So instead of assigning children to the current value every single render, which even though it was safe in the end, didn't look very safe, instead of doing it there, we moved that. I suggested that we move that into these two blocks instead, where this one's happening on server side and this one's happening within a use effect. So it became a little more safe, a little more understandable for what was happening. So yeah, that's how to use ref safely in concurrency mode. Don't rely on previous ref values. And honestly, unless you really, really have to, I would just suggest putting all of your your ref manipulations inside of an effect if you can. The only reason you want to bring it out of a use effect is if you need to manipulate it synchronously before something renders here. So for instance, right here is 0. Well, technically we want to increment that before we would want to increment that before we render, but now we're relying on a previous value. So what can we do? We could probably just say react.useEffect, put it inside of a use effect, and just start it at 1. That way, hey, it's rendered one time. Let's see, use effect. Oh, set state. And see, it actually isn't re-rendering because nothing in the component is actually changing. That's super cool. So when possible, put your ref mutations inside of useEffect. If you do have to bring them out into the synchronous render function, then don't rely on previous values. You know, it has to be some type of an immutable value or random value or whatever that you're just keeping track of. I hope this was helpful. There's a couple of articles out there that are really that are good reads about this too. Let's see, useRef concurrent mode. In fact, that's a good one right there. Yeah, by Daishi Keito. useRef in concurrent mode. How to avoid shooting yourself in the foot. I actually haven't read this yet, but I did see it while I was looking around. It's really probably a pretty good article. How to properly use the React useRef hook in concurrent mode. Great articles. Oh, it's the same guy just reposted. So I would go check those out. Concurrent mode is going to be great. It's going to come with some pitfalls for some, I think. So the better prepared we can be for that, I I think we're going to be very happy with concurrent mode. So thanks for listening, you guys, and we'll talk to you later. See ya.